Every morning at 59, I eat the same 30 grams of protein before I do anything else. Not because I counted calories, because I finally understood what my body was actually asking for after menopause. And it wasn't less food at breakfast. It was a specific number I was consistently missing by half. For years, breakfast was the meal I cared about least. A piece of toast, some fruit, coffee, obviously. It felt light, virtuous, the kind of breakfast a healthy person eats. And for most of my life, that was fine. It's what changed after menopause that I didn't understand for a long time. I remember standing in my kitchen a couple of years ago looking at my usual breakfast. Toast, half a banana, coffee, and thinking about something my doctor had said almost in passing at my last checkup. She'd mentioned, while glancing at my chart, that my muscle mass had dropped since my last scan, and that this was pretty typical at my age. She said it the way you'd mention the weather. Typical. Expected. Nothing to really do about it. I didn't push back in the moment, but I remember standing there afterward with my ordinary breakfast in front of me, wondering if that typical decline was actually as unavoidable as it sounded, or if it was just what happens when nobody tells you what your body actually needs differently now. Here's where I want to start, because it surprised me the most. Visceral fat, the deep abdominal fat that sits around your organs, not just under your skin, doesn't rise steadily throughout midlife. Research following women through the menopause transition found that visceral fat increases sharpest right up to the point of menopause itself and then levels off in the years after. It's not a slow, even climb. It's concentrated in a specific window right around the transition. And what's happening in that same window isn't just hormonal. A long-term study out of Pennington Biomedical Research Center tracked women's body composition, energy expenditure, and diet across the menopause transition, and found something I didn't expect. In the years leading up to menopause, women's daily energy expenditure and fat oxidation both dropped. That part isn't surprising. Most of us have heard that metabolism shifts during this time. What surprised me was the other finding in the same study. Dietary protein and fiber intake were also measurably higher in the years before menopause onset than they were by the time menopause actually hit. In other words, protein intake tends to quietly decline, right as the body's ability to handle less of it is also declining. Two things moving in the wrong direction at the same time, without anyone telling you either one is happening. That's the backdrop. Estrogen dropping, energy expenditure slowing, and protein intake naturally sliding, often without any conscious decision behind it. You're not doing anything wrong. You're just eating the way you always did, at a time when the math underneath has quietly changed. So when I started looking into what to actually do about it, I expected the answer to be about eating less, or exercising more, or some kind of trade-off. What I found instead had almost nothing to do with restriction. It had to do with a number I had never once thought about in my life. The amount of protein in a single meal. Muscle tissue rebuilds itself constantly. Every time you eat protein, your body has the chance to trigger a process called muscle protein synthesis, essentially using that protein to repair and maintain muscle. But here's the part that changed how I eat breakfast specifically. As we age, our muscles become less responsive to that signal. Researchers call this anabolic resistance. It means a meal that would have been enough protein to trigger muscle repair in your 30s may simply not be enough anymore in your 50s and 60s, even if the amount looks identical on paper. There's an actual threshold involved. Multiple studies on aging muscle point to older adults needing somewhere around 30 to 40 grams of protein in a single sitting, containing roughly 3 grams of leucine specifically, to meaningfully trigger that repair signal. Below that amount, the process is only partially activated, not off completely, but not doing its job either. A 2024 review in the journal Frontiers in Nutrition, pulling together this line of research, describes this leucine threshold as one of the more consistent findings in the field of aging and muscle health. What struck me most is that this isn't about total protein across the whole day. You could technically eat enough protein by dinner time to hit every general recommendation out there, and still have wasted your body's best opportunity to trigger repair that morning, simply because no single meal crossed the threshold on its own. Muscle protein synthesis doesn't seem to work like a running tally you can catch up on later in the day. Each meal appears to get its own separate shot at triggering the signal, and a meal that falls short doesn't carry over. That reframed the whole question for me. It wasn't how much protein am I eating today. It was, did any single meal today actually clear the bar? Leucine itself is worth naming, because it's not evenly distributed across protein sources the way I assumed. Animal proteins, eggs, dairy, meat, fish, tend to be leucine dense relative to their size, which makes it easier to hit that 3-gram mark without eating an enormous portion. Plant proteins can absolutely get you there too, but often require a larger volume or a more deliberate combination to reach the same leucine content, which is worth knowing if breakfast for you is plant-based. And this is where breakfast became the obvious place to start, because breakfast is almost always the meal furthest below that number. A slice of toast with butter, a bowl of cereal, even a fairly healthy breakfast, oatmeal, a banana, some yogurt, often lands somewhere around 8 to 12 grams of protein. Nowhere close to the 30-gram mark that seems to matter most for someone my age. I want to connect this back to something I talked about in a previous video, because it isn't a separate issue. It's the same mechanism from a different angle. Muscle is one of the largest sites in your body for using up blood sugar after a meal. Less muscle, or muscle that isn't being actively maintained, means less capacity to handle the food you eat, which circles right back around to insulin sensitivity and, eventually, to how and where your body decides to store fat, including visceral fat specifically, since visceral fat is metabolically active tissue that responds directly to those same signals. Undersized muscle isn't just a strength issue, it's a storage issue. So the shift I made wasn't dramatic. It was specific. I stopped treating breakfast as the light meal of the day and started treating it as the one meal I was most likely to be shortchanging. Every morning now, I eat something built around roughly 30 grams of protein before I do anything else, usually 2 or 3 eggs with a serving of Greek yogurt on the side, or a smaller egg portion with a scoop of protein powder blended into it if I'm short on time. Some mornings, it's cottage cheese with a handful of nuts. The exact food matters less than hitting that number reliably, every single day, without having to think too hard about it. What I didn't expect was how much this changed the rest of my day, not just my morning. Because that meal wasn't leaving me hungry an hour later the way toast and coffee used to, I stopped grazing through the late morning without really registering it. And because I wasn't chronically running behind on protein from the very first meal, I found I didn't have to overcorrect later in the day to catch up, which is exactly the kind of quiet, cumulative shift that's easy to miss if you're only looking at any single meal in isolation. I also want to be honest about the limits of what I actually know here. The research on the leucine threshold and anabolic resistance is well established in the broader field of aging and muscle health, but a lot of it comes from studies on muscle protein synthesis generally, not from studies measuring visceral fat directly as an outcome. I'm connecting two things that are mechanistically linked, muscle maintenance and metabolic health, based on what the research shows about each piece individually. That's a reasonable inference. But it isn't the same as a single study proving that eating 30 grams of protein at breakfast reduces visceral fat in postmenopausal women specifically. I haven't found a trial that directly tested that exact claim, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. Quick note, because this is worth repeating every time. I'm not a doctor, and nothing in this video is medical advice. This reflects my own experience and general research, not a diagnosis or recommendation tailored to you. If you have kidney issues, are on medications that affect protein metabolism, or have any condition where higher protein intake needs to be managed carefully, please talk to your doctor before changing how you eat, especially during menopause when so much else is shifting at the same time. Looking back, I spent years treating breakfast like it barely mattered, a formality before the real meals of the day. What I didn't realize is that it was the meal most likely to fall short of a very specific number my body needed, at exactly the point in life when falling short of that number started to matter more than it used to. I think about that comment from my doctor sometimes. Pretty typical at my age, and I understand now why she said it that way. From what she sees across her patients, it probably is typical. Most breakfasts do look like mine used to. Most of us were never taught that the meal we treat as an afterthought is often the exact meal working against us. That doesn't make it inevitable. It just makes it common. And common isn't the same thing as unchangeable. I'm not eating more overall. I'm not restricting anything either. I'm just making sure the very first meal of my day actually crosses the threshold. My muscles need to hear the signal. 30 grams, every morning, before anything else. It's the smallest change I've made in years, and it's the one that stuck the longest. If you've been eating a light breakfast for most of your life the way I was, it might be worth asking whether light is actually serving you anymore, or whether it's just a habit that's easiest to keep.